So grading period 2 deals a lot with the argument essay. And I usually start off with rhetorical analysis because it's a lot more structured. It really deals with just doing analysis, seeing what other authors have done in terms of their argument. But now it's your turn. So in essay 3 on the AP exam, you're going to now have the task of making your own argument to a prompt that they will randomly give you. So really, it's just being prepared for any sort of topic and being able to sustain evidence. So if there's two things that you're taking away from this particular video, but also just in general, two things for your argument essay. Number one, as much evidence as possible and as concrete as possible. Number two, this is where you're actually going to be tested of your writing voice in terms of being persuasive, using devices on your own, and in general, organizing everything all together. So let's look at the 2019 prompt real quick. This is legit last year's, and this is a good example to use because there's a new rubric, as you know, this year at 6 points, and they graded this essay using the 6 point, and they break it down and explain why. So now there's a very clear distinction and understanding of what makes a 6, a 5, and so forth. So last year, their prompt was this. The term overrated is often used to diminish concepts, places, roles, etc. that the speaker believes do not deserve the prestige they commonly enjoy. For example, many writers have argued that success is overrated. A character in a novel by Anthony Burgess famously describes Rome as a, quote, vastly overrated city. And Queen Rania of Jordan herself has asserted that, quote, being queen is overrated. Select a concept, place, role, etc. to which you believe that the term overrated should be applied. Then write a well-developed essay in which you explain your judgment. Use appropriate evidence from your reading, experience, or observations to support your argument. So in short, basically, we use the term underrated, overrated in this modern society, but in general, in the past, people have used it to diminish particular things because it's kind of like, you know what, it's not worth it. A queen's really not that great, Rome's not that great, so in this case, we're trying to break down what society sees as perhaps amazing, great, and so forth. So in this case, you're only going to select one concept, one place, one role. Can't do multiple, but using that one particular concept you're working with, can you explain it thoroughly, piece by piece, evidence by evidence? So remember, we are going to use the BS chart here and there for hot seat in general. So in this case here, let's consider then how I approach this particular prompt. So this was done in a little bit less than 5 minutes, but otherwise I did the BS chart as well, right? Opinion, personal connections, connections to the world, connections to readings. You don't have to fill all of them in because you just need what you need in terms of the evidences here. For example, if you can do all connections to the world, great, go for it. But if you are only keeping to the opinion and personal, like red zones, maybe not. It should be a little bit more expansive to things that are actually real. So my opinion, something that's overrated could be the literary canon, basically traditional books, right? Like we teach Catcher in the Rye, we teach Lord of Flies, whatever, and those are considered great novels. But at the same time, I'm thinking like, well, they're kind of outdated. They're kind of overrated in the sense that we've been reading it for years and years, promoting them as these great literary achievements, but are they, right? Because what happens is by praising these books, we kind of look down on books that aren't literary canons then. So a personal example for me is I read a lot of the novels, the literary canon in high school myself, and to me, you know, it was complex, it was not rewarding in knowledge. It just felt like it took a lot of work to understand a general idea without really connecting with characters or whatever, right? So in this case here, I have some of my own sort of conflicts with the literary canon. But on the other hand, because I have studied it for the most part here, I do found value in terms of its praise. So I might offer like a concession, I might offer a different perspective regarding that there. So those are on my personal levels. Now, in terms of connections to the world, I might talk about Shakespeare, for example, because he is one of the sort of like faces of the literary canon, right? Like he's supposed to be the image of the English literature, about poetry and all that. But for me, I find him a nuisance to teach in high school just because it is just so dense of a reading without really much significance past the historicals. So for me, I might be looking at that, and also I'm looking at modern times and how modern works are better used to define us than these things called the canon. On the other hand, on my connection to readings, I might look at young adult novels versus major novels, because for me, novels like Whale Talk, which is about like high schoolers who struggle with, you know, the pressures of high school, peer pressuring, self-image, all that, it does a better job than Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which James Joyce, one of the greatest novelists of the 20th century, writes. Even though it's a great work, it doesn't really come to help those in the 21st century because it's just so antiquated in terms of that. So I might argue the differences between the two. So that's my choices at least, but otherwise it's whatever you feel like you can do in the first 5 minutes of brainstorming. So BS chart that, and then you start organizing, which we'll do later on. So let's look at the actual student sample they gave in 2019. This one is a 6 out of 6, the ones that actually succeeded. So this student here, we're going to look at their topic. They talk about capitalism. It's like, whoa, that's very broad and at the same time complex, because capitalism is such a tricky term to work with. It is a system of government, but it's also, or sorry, not government, a system of market, but at the same time, it's also sort of like a modern philosophy that we kind of work under as, yeah, it works. It's better than communism, it's better than socialism, whatever. So their first thesis in talking about it, you can read the context or the prior stuff later, but looking at their thesis, they wrote, when considering the downsides, capitalism is clearly overrated as it commodifies humanity and uplifts a minority at the expense of the majority. Okay, I buy that. That seems like a workable thesis because they're probably going to argue about the fact that it commodifies humanity, so I'll see how that works out. Uplifts a minority, I'm assuming the rich, and at the expense of the majority, those who are working class, middle class, and so forth. So the paragraphs are set up already. It's a nice, clear thesis. You get 1 out of 1, and also the stuff in the intro paragraph itself builds up to that. So if you remember from last year in 2A, when we talked about Marxism or just Marxist critique and talked about like how capitalism is something that he criticizes, hey, that stuff's not useless. That stuff is able to be applied to any sort of argument if it's relevant. So things like post-colonialism, the feminist things that we mentioned last week, and all that, if you can retain that, boom, your depth of knowledge is so much bigger for this argument essay here. Now, let's look at their first body paragraph topic sentence. They wrote, one of the key problems with capitalism is how it commodifies basic humanity. From a moral standpoint, it is wrong to put a price on human life because human life is worth more than even the highest price tag could express. So in this case, they took one of the points in their thesis, they expanded a little bit more in the topic sentence, and now they're going to give me some evidence to back it up. So even though it's a good topic sentence, you got to make sure that it's actually backed up with evidences to prove your point. So further in the paragraph, they give you some examples, and the second paragraph they give is this one. Another clear failure to protect humanity occurred in Flint, Michigan. Residents in this area were left without clean running water for years while the government and others in power sat idly by with the $55 million that has been promised to fix the issue. They only recently had their pipes fixed, and many have noted that the problems with a government that can but will not help its citizens. Meanwhile, the government was allowing water companies such as Nestle to take resources from the area, which incited further public outrage. Any government or society that prioritizes profit over human life is broken. Whoa, this is kind of complex because just on the top of their head, they had this memory or this point in their head that the government promised $55 million, that they gave Nestle these benefits, and that in Flint, Michigan, we had this whole issue. They drew this from their memory, boom, put it on paper. That's some good evidence because, again, this was not the only evidence in their paragraph. They had another one that led into this one, but both of them proves the point of not protecting humanity. So in this case, they got 4 out of 4 for evidence. Their evidence is linked with each other. They got a multiple amounts of good evidences that relate to the real world. It's not just opinion. It's just a personal experience. It really is a connection to the world around you. And furthermore, sophistication. In this particular example, they wrote about Jeff Bezos in another paragraph. One such individual, Jeff Bezos, at one point has the wealth to buy every homeless person, not family, but person, nice voice there, in the U.S., a $200,000 house and still fix Flint's pipes 12 times over. This man is a great example of someone uplifted at the expense of the majority, as his company, Amazon, is frequently criticized for his poor wages and conditions for workers. Bezos could improve this, as he could get everyone of his employees off food stamps if he reduced his wealth by less than 1%, but he does not. Wow, this is a very specific example in the modern world, and it makes a lot of criticisms about rich people, about those who are in corporations, and even uses some examples in the beginning of it here to prove a point, sort of an analogy, like, hey, look how much this guy owns. He could pay literally this much and people would be lifted from poverty, but he doesn't, so, thank you, rich people. So in this case here, sophistication comes from the author's writing voice. It comes from their examples that they provide. This is a very clever usage of sophistication. So all in all, just keep in mind, try to be as sophisticated as possible in your examples. If your examples are surface level, then your writing becomes surface level. So for argument, especially for the take-home one, I challenge you to find as best examples because you can do all the research you want and draw from as much memory as you need to.